Perfect. So thank you so much to everybody for being here today. As Tina said, my name is Dan Egan, and I'm on the board of directors for CORD, and excited to welcome you to our monthly series for CORD Connects. And based on, I think, the number of people who RSVP'd, as well as I think our enthusiasm for another virtual year, we are excited to have our friends here from the Mount Sinai Morningside West program here to talk to us about some strategies for virtual recruitment season this year. So just briefly, we have their entire team, which is really exciting. So we have Dr. Chen, who's the program director at Mount Sinai Morningside West, and where she also completed her residency and was chief resident there. Also has a master's of science in teaching, and was a previous clerkship director and APD prior to her current role. Dr. Chris Hahn is associate program director, trained at Highland, and also might be known as the EMC-MD if you follow him on Twitter. Dr. Felipe Serrano is assistant program director, completed his training at Vanderbilt, and interests include health equity, disparities, and resident education. Dr. Chris Richardson is co-director of the EM clerkship at Mount Sinai Morningside West. He completed his residency in emergency medicine at the University of Cincinnati, and then a hospice and palliative care medicine fellowship at Mount Sinai Hospital. And Dr. Jasleen Singh, who is one of the chief residents at Morningside West, involved in the virtual recruitment season last year and runs the social media account for their program. And so with that, I will turn it over to our group. They have asked and encouraged kind of questions along the way if you want to put them into the chat, and given their number of panelists, they will probably self-moderate, and then I can also jump in and interject as needed. So with that, I will turn it over, I presume, to Dr. He.
Great, thanks, Dan. And we do have one more speaker who is joining us, who's Dr. Stefan Luston. He's one of our third-year residents, and he was actually very instrumental in running our JEDI committee, which we will also be telling you a little bit about during our presentation. So our presentation is titled Another Year on Zoom, Ideas for Successful Virtual Recruitment. And this is not to say, look how successful we were, but despite the challenges, we do feel like the recruitment season went okay for us last year. And just to give you some numbers in terms of how we did, we ended up landing in a similar, if not better, place on our rank list, and then also meeting some goals that we had tried to set for ourselves despite the virtual recruitment season. And we ended up recruiting 50% women, 25% URMs, and then actually, interestingly, 50% of our intern class comes from outside of the Northeast, which is usually our bread and butter in terms of who's coming into us. But mostly, we really are hoping to present some things and ideas that we felt like worked well during our first virtual recruitment season, as well as some things that maybe didn't work so well. And hopefully this will be a springboard for some inspiration, and as well as some discussion in how to make this next season good, if not better, for everyone. Next slide. So as you all probably know, earlier this month, COPA made preliminary recommendations for another all virtual interview season. So I think many of us were waiting to kind of see what direction this was headed in. And so, most likely we are headed towards another completely virtual season with very limited ability for applicants to see, experience our programs in person, and also to meet us. And so although the final recommendations are pending, I think this is where we are all headed. Next slide. So looking back to last year, our program actually had another unique challenge. So perhaps when you saw the ad for this CORD Connect session, you asked yourself, what program is Mount Sinai Morningside West? And the reason for that is because we were actually known as St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital for 24 years, before 2020. So as we merged with the Mount Sinai Health System in New York City, the names of our two hospitals slowly changed over time. And so in addition to being the first virtual recruitment season in all of emergency medicine, we were also facing the fact that we were also trying to sell a program with a completely different name to applicants from around the country. And I bring this up because despite being one of the oldest EM programs in New York City, and so SLR was very well known to, I think the medical students in this region, but also our kind of vast collection of alumni around the country, we were suddenly faced with some new marketing issues. We couldn't really just kind of rely on this recognition of our name. And so we really had to think a little bit, we thought outside of the box, really ramp up our marketing in terms of recruitment. And so perhaps this thought process will be useful to some of the newer programs, or perhaps some programs that are kind of facing this marketing issue in terms of getting their names out to applicants from around the country, especially when they're kind of faced with virtual recruitment. So to start with, we had to really think about what we were selling at this program, and specifically what set our program apart from the sea of programs, not just in the New York area, but also the rest of the country. And so, with this point, it's really, I encourage you all to think about the things that set you apart and to kind of focus on those pieces when you are attending virtual recruitment fairs and when you're going through the interview season. So some of the things, for example, that we felt like were unique to our program: location. New York is usually attractive to applicants who are applying to us. And it usually speaks for itself in terms of people who are interested in moving here. And we are also the only hospitals on the west side of Manhattan, which allows for a large catchment area, diversity of cases, et cetera. But, during COVID, we also had to kind of think about, we were the first to kind of be hit during the pandemic. And also, who's really going to want to move here from California to live in a 400 square foot studio apartment during quarantine? So, kind of thinking about how to make that New York City geographic piece as attractive as perhaps it had been in the past. Second, our clinical training, we're a 3-year program, one of only 2 in Manhattan. And so just kind of different ways to sell that and really kind of get the facts about our program out there. And then finally, I think this is the most important piece, which we really kind of struggled to think about how we were going to sell this piece during the recruitment season, which is, if you ask any of our residents why they chose our program, perhaps one of the biggest factors was that when they interacted with our residents, especially in person during the interview season, during the interview social, they felt like there was a really strong sense of community, cohesiveness, support, that this really felt like a family to them, and these were the people that they fit with. And so, thinking about how we could really sell that to applicants who were not going to be able to meet us in person, and see how our residents interacted in a room together. So based on this, we had some challenges to consider. As I mentioned, how do we sell New York City in the midst of the COVID pandemic? How do we recruit a geographically diverse class? Or are we thinking that we would only be recruiting people in the New York area? How can we present our program to people who are not going to be able to visit? And then how can we make sure that the applicants really get to know the heart of our program, which, as I mentioned, we feel like is one of the biggest selling points, and the residents themselves, how we were able to kind of get that sense of personality across to people. So first, we really needed to boost on our line presence. So, before, whereas we might not have been so aggressive about, a polished online presence, this became really important during the recruitment season last year. So no more budget website. We really had to revamp our website, make sure that everything on the website was accurate, and also, the message that we were trying to convey. And Jasleen's going to talk a little bit more about this, because she was really very instrumental in increasing our online presence in terms of social media, and in terms of just kind of connecting with applicants around the country. And then we did also put a lot of effort and time into a formal recruitment video that up until that point we really didn't have. But as we all know, what you see online is not necessarily what you're going to get in reality. And unlike this picture, we actually thought what we had in person was much better than what people were going to get online. And so we really wanted to also make sure that there was an element where applicants could get a sense of who we were in person with a little bit more depth than what they could see in a recruitment video or, in shorter info sessions online. So to accomplish this, we set up a virtual clerkship, which Dr. Richardson will talk a little bit about. We also put a lot of time and effort into thinking about how we could run our interview socials in a way that was very interactive and kind of showed more of the personality of the program. And then we organized some specific second look events that were virtual, but were specifically targeted towards women and diversity recruitment, which was something that we had kind of specifically set out as a goal for the season.
All right, so I'm going to speak a little bit about our virtual clerkship. And we realized, I think, pretty early on in the recruitment season that we needed to find a way to replace one of our traditional drivers of residency applicants, and that being a very active visiting student clerkship. So in a normal year, we host about 45 to 50 visiting students in person. But in March of 2020, our medical school pulled all of our student learners out of the emergency department. And then pretty soon after, we had guidelines stating that students really shouldn't be doing away rotations. And so how do we replace this? So when the students were pulled out of our emergency department, at that point in the year, it was students just completing a core emergency medicine rotation. And the school asked us to quickly put together a virtual curriculum, which we essentially did by just kind of transposing the types of didactics and sessions that we would do during a normal in-person clerkship, and trying to cram as much of that into Zoom as possible. Then supplementing that with core content lectures. How do you work up chest pain? How do you resuscitate a trauma patient? And that sort of thing. That met our medical school's requirements, but it wasn't really going to win the hearts and minds of visiting EM-bound students. And so we had to think a little bit closer about how to do that. Next slide, please. So when we think about how our normal in-person rotation feeds into our recruitment process, number one, it's a huge driver to interns who ultimately end up matching with us, right? So I said that we typically have 45 to 50 students rotate with us a year, and typically 30 to 40% of our incoming intern class has rotated with us in person on our audition rotation. So it's an important driver there. Obviously, it exposes the students to New York City emergency medicine. We have particular challenges of space and staffing, which really aren't for everyone. And we like to make sure that the students who are coming here for residency know and understand that. It lets the students who rotate showcase their skills and showcase directly to residency leadership. So we make sure that each student has a chance to work with either the program leadership or the clerkship leadership, so that we can really see one-on-one, what are their clinical skills? How do they handle our environment? What are their interpersonal skills? And then lastly, it's a really important, assessment of their personality fit for our program. So we talk a lot about the SLR family. One of the ways that we see whether students are going to fit into this is how do they interact with our residents at conferences and at social events. And so these are, from a recruitment perspective, the types of things that we were trying to accomplish with our rotation. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about our virtual rotation format and curriculum, to start with, we decided to make it a 2-week rotation with 8 instructional days and then 2 of our residency conferences. Our core rotation is 4 weeks. That's a lot of time to spend on Zoom, both for the students and then also for the educational faculty in our program. And so we felt like we could accomplish something in 2 weeks, and I think we were successful with that. We had the curriculum focus mostly on clinical reasoning and emergency medicine. We assumed that these students would all have a chance to do a home rotation at their medical school and get some of the basics about how to work up chest pain and trauma and those sorts of complaints there. So we tried to conceive of a curriculum that would extend that and focus a lot on evidence-based medicine, critical appraisal of resources, how to be a learner in emergency medicine, and then some didactics that touch on things that are important to EM, but maybe not part of the sort of standard curriculum at each rotation. So for example, I taught a session on pain and symptom management, which is something we do every day for every patient, but is not in a lot of MS4 kind of core curriculum. Our teaching sessions were all designed to be small groups that were taught by our core faculty. We wanted our faculty to get exposed to these students. We wanted our students to get exposed to the core teaching faculty in the residency. And for each session, we used a flipped classroom approach. So we put some onus on the students to prepare something in advance, which allowed us to spend a smaller amount of time on Zoom, but a higher yield portion of that time. And then we also designed some activities that had the students work with each other. So we had them work in pairs or small groups to present a journal club, to present didactics. We had an ongoing Slack discussion group where we discussed cases. And there we were really able to see the students' leadership abilities, their interpersonal skills. Were they just trying to show off or were they trying to build each other up? And then we One other innovation was a virtual precepting session. So we paired each student up with our program leadership and our clerkship leadership. We provided the students information in advance on 6 clinical cases and had them synthesize that information into a patient presentation and have what was essentially a mock oral boards encounter with our teaching faculty. We thought this gave a really good insight into their ability to think through a case and think critically. And when we spend 10 hours on shift with a student, we might get snippets of this, but this was a chance to spend an hour and a half really diving deeply into the student's thought process. And I think we all thought it was really valuable. And then lastly, our residents during this time were having virtual happy hours and virtual get-togethers, and we invited the students to that. And they were able to interact with our small groups in weekly conferences with the residents. So a little bit of our personality fit objective. I think I'll turn it over to Chris.
Yeah, so thank you. So in addition to the clerkship, we were really trying to maximize the amount of time that we could get applicants spending time with our residents and being able to see our department. And as Chen already mentioned, no more budget website. I think that goes without saying. When people are going to your website, that is really your face to the applicants now. When they can't come see you in person, they're going to get a lot of first impressions based on it, for better or worse. So having that kind of updated and being able to talk about your program, I think is really important. But in addition to just the website, we wanted to be able to convey the gestalt. What is it that Chen was talking about before that sets us apart? What are the pieces that we feel are difficult to convey with someone clicking through your website that you really want to get across? And so we had thought for years about putting together a recruitment video, and obviously last year, being so unique, really made us want to move forward with it. Now, we used a professional filmmaker to make our video. And I would say that for us, it made sense from a budget perspective. For you, if you do not want to make a professional video, that's fine. There's many different ways of being able to go about this. I've made some in residency that were successful, but just make sure that it's good, because you don't want to turn people away from your video if it's not well thought out. So I think you basically have 2 to maybe 6 minutes, depending on how well you think you can hold the audience's attention, to try to tell applicants who you are and why they should come to you for residency. So this, I think, is an important piece to add to your website, to be able to add to your social media. It's an easy thing that people can kind of just have a link and send to other people to kind of produce more interest in your program. And I will say that when we sat down to make this video, initially, I guess I didn't really understand how much time and effort it was really going to take. So it is not a small project, especially if you're going to work with a professional filmmaker, but really thinking about the things that you want to convey. That is the key, because then everything is going to build out from there. If you weren't starting on the right framework, you're not going to like, what comes out from it. So just understand that it is a pretty big undertaking, and that you really want to get buy-in from your department and as many people as possible. For us, we think it's really important for people to see how we interact together on shift. So we have basically film of, obviously no patient information, but people interacting together on shift that hopefully conveys, who we are in a way that you can't get otherwise. Next slide, please. So in addition to the website and the recruitment video, we found another way to directly interact with applicants are information sessions. So there's kind of 2 big forms of these that I see. One of them are the kind of more formal sessions that are put on by organizations such as SAEM. There's actually one next week. So if you haven't signed up yet, I have no, financial interest or whatever, but it's, it's something to consider because I found that last year we were able to reach a large number of people. There was a lot of medical students signed up for it last year, and I'm hoping for similar turnout this year. And we probably were able to access, candidates that wouldn't otherwise have reached out. I can't say that for sure, but it seemed like a worthwhile effort. And it's, if I could make a suggestion, it would be, this is a more formal information session about who your program is from the residency leadership perspective. But we also tried to maximize the number of residents that were present also, because I think that shows that the residents are invested in the next class, and medical students notice that. And it's also very helpful when you have a resident being able to answer questions about what life is like as a resident. You know, you're not as good as being faculty to know exactly what it's like being the resident boots on the ground. So that's a really helpful piece. The second big kind of umbrella of information sessions are ones that you can put on as a program. And what we have listed down there at the bottom are some of the topics that we covered. Now, these are information sessions that we had run by residents, and they're meant to be more informal. They're kind of the replacement for the interview day where you're getting a tour by a resident or sitting down with them at lunch and having a more kind of back and forth discussion about things that are important to them and the things that we have at our residency that may be unique. So we had sessions where we talked about the fellowships, and we did have our fellowship directors show up for those in case fellowship directors or the fellows to be able to kind of just provide specifics on those programs. But then there were some more general topics, the COVID-19 reflections being the first epicenter of the pandemic, our focus on wellness and what that means, diversity and inclusion, and then women in EM as well. Now, if these topics don't make sense for you and for some reason, you can also just kind of pick topics that I've seen, such as, why choose emergency medicine? You may be speaking to applicants that haven't fully settled on their specialty yet. So you can kind of just attract more people and kind of start the conversation in that way as well. So kind of think outside the box in terms of how you can bring people to the table to just sit and have conversations with. And the more they get to see us and understand who we are, it's also helpful from our perspective because our residents were able to gain a lot of insight to some of the applicants that were coming to, multiple sessions. Now, one of the ways that we encouraged attendance to these was for residents to contact the medical school interest group at their home medical school or their previous medical school. And then we also could reach out through our home medical school as well. But sometimes, and we had good turnout, but I think if you think about this from one perspective, it's kind of like a tree falling in the forest, right? If a bunch of, faculty and residents show up to put on an information session and no applicants show up to hear it, did it really happen? So the big question is, how are you going to get people to come to these sessions? How are you going to generate interest? That I think is a big challenge that honestly we have thought better left to the residents to figure out, because we've had them run our social media account because they are obviously more savvy and they know what people want to see as opposed to, from our perspective. So the next step in all of this is, how do you actually generate interest for all of these sessions that you want to get out there? And I'll pass it off to one of our chiefs who is our expert.
So we promoted our information sessions through social media, along with having our residents specifically reach out to their emergency medicine interest groups for their respective schools. Our Instagram specifically was a huge asset, especially according to our new intern class. We used it to disseminate information and showcase our program. But again, why bother with this when you can just post pictures on a website? We used Instagram as more of a dynamic source of content. It let our followers into like the daily lives of our residents. We used a story feature to do this. And for those of you that aren't really familiar with Instagram stories, they're brief pictures that you use or videos that you can post on your profile that are just meant to be clicked through and followed on more of a daily basis. They self-delete in 24 hours. So it's a way to post content without cluttering your professional page. We added stories of our residents at work, out in the city, and during the peak pandemic, we used it to express our gratitude for our local businesses supporting our healthcare workers. If a series of photos follows a particular storyline or theme, you can keep it on your page permanently so it doesn't self-delete in 24 hours. So that's just another tool to use it as. For example, we permanently highlighted stories if we were posting something about the history of St. Luke's Roosevelt, just as we did through a series of old photos that were displayed in our hospital hallways, or on a more lighthearted note, about a series of photos of our residents and attendings wearing a flat button picture of one of our residents' faces that was somehow getting passed along in an adventure of, quote, Flat Dusty. And this is an example of that series of photos. Instagram posts themselves we used more formally, and the next slide is an example of one of our more recent posts. We spotlighted our residents a few times a month in a mini interview that helped everyone, including our own colleagues, to get to know them a little better. We highlighted where they were from, fun facts, advice for future residents, and of course their favorite ice cream flavor. We expanded this to eventually include more of our alumni and faculty and recent graduates. So apart from this, we posted about major announcements, accomplishments and talks, conferences, and every now and then matching scrub photos, because we are definitely a #WearFigs family, as showcased in this picture. Next slide.
One thing, Jess, that I wanted to add to what you said is one of the things that I think was very powerful was that the residents decided to do a vaccine outreach through the social media, which garnered a lot of attention from both the PR department of our institution and some of the local media. And it was through kind of their effort on the social media page of doing that, that they got sort of that acknowledgement.
Yeah, and we kept those videos up on our Instagram page for future followers and new fans of our pages. So our pre-interview socials were a big selling point for our program. Our residents would host dinners for our applicants and other residents, and it'd be an opportunity for everyone to experience firsthand what the special sense of community that we always talk about, and for the applicants themselves to get a sense of whether they belong. So to do this virtually was pretty difficult. Everyone is forced into a large manufactured pseudo-social environment, and with a bunch of people they don't really know, attempting to make a connection or stand out in the midst of lagging computers, microphone troubles, etc. So we had some trial and errors with attempting online games, Jackbox TV, House Party, but we found the most success with virtual trivia. And this worked pretty well for us. We were able to mimic most closely what ends up happening during our pre-interview socials. When a few residents and some applicants kind of break up into smaller groups and get to know each other better, rather than trying to meet every single person in the room. So we split residents and applicants evenly up into breakout rooms and gave them time to get to know each other, ask questions about the program, discuss trivia questions, which served as more of memorable talking points. And while doing all that, they could learn a few fun facts, particularly about New York City. And then after they were done with that, we kind of bring them back into the larger group, go over the questions, highlight some funny answers, and it, based on our feedback, it has served as a pretty memorable experience for a lot of our current residents and prior applicants.
I'm going next, but I really want to emphasize the importance of these sessions and how incredibly well run our residents did. This is all resident driven, and it was pretty much the highlight. We could not hear more praise from the applicants who came to interview about these sessions that were led by our residents and how different it was from what they saw in the rest of the trail, how they were able to break into smaller groups. There was a goal to the session, right? So you're a team competing in trivia, then you go back to the main group, are able to sort of joke about things and go back into your small group and ask sort of the questions about the program. And so this sort of, I think, single-handedly was probably kind of the strongest thing that was done by our program in terms of the interview day to really kind of push things forward and really showcase our people, which we thought was going to be the hardest thing to do.
To add to that, med students really look forward to seeing like resident engagement, and they really want to see that the people that they're going to be working with for the next couple of years are invested in them coming into the program and investing in getting to know them. So making sure that, you know, having active participation amongst your faculty and staff who are currently, faculty and residents who are currently at the hospital, participating with the new applicants is a really big thing that med students really pay attention to. And they really notice when residents don't really show up to these pre-interview socials or these events to get to know them. And they kind of use it as it can be positive if residents are really active participating with them.
Stefan, do you want to talk, before I kind of go into the interview day, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of our second look sessions and sort of how JEDI got involved in some of that?
Yeah, so in particular to our social media run events and as well as our pre-interview info sessions, we also have two groups as part of SLR known as the JEDI Justice, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, as well as our Women in EM Committee. where we essentially highlighted, underrepresented groups in medicine and realizing that they need also support in attracting them into residency programs. Emergency medicine is notoriously, had issues with increasing diversity within the specialty. In addition to that, we had our info sessions highlighting the different components that we worked on here as a program, including efforts in like education and curriculum, simulation training, community outreach, fundraising, and just overall community support for these applicants. We also created these second look events, in which case we highlighted specific days where residents who identify as either women, LGBTQ, or underrepresented in medicine could show up to these second look events and get to interact with residents of similar demographics to them, as well as faculty members, and kind of get to probe their minds and get to, ask, important questions to them about, the new city that they're going to be living in, how do they feel supported in the program, and general questions about, residency that they may not ask on a larger scale during their interview session, which was key. And we had such a large turnout in terms of medical students reaching out to us. However, it does require a lot of intention. You have to really be focused on reaching out to these individual applicants, reaching out to the med school, reaching out to minority groups such as SNMA or Latin Medical Student National Medical Association, or LMSA, which is the Latin Medical Student Association, and reaching out to these individual groups in order to kind of garner interest from applicants and letting them know that you're interested and engaged and trying to reach out to them as well.
Sweet. So I get to talk about probably the most anxiety-provoking part of virtual recruitment session, which was the interview day over Zoom, which, as everyone knows, is as error-prone as they come. And so it was no different for us. So we went through kind of some trials and tribulations as to how to do this correctly. And we tried to do sort of different formats that worked either not very well or ended up working fairly decently well. So first thing we thought about was, let's try to kind of create a traditional setup like we normally would do in an in-person interview, right? So in a normal in-person interview, you have the interviewers sit in their office and the applicants kind of rotate around from room to room as they go kind of down their interview day. However, it turns out that it's very tricky to train interviewees to kind of be able to switch from breakout room to breakout room in the middle of a Zoom session efficiently. So it's very difficult to get 8 applicants to appropriately kind of move from Zoom room to Zoom. And so what we ended up doing was we actually flipped it, right? So we assigned rooms for each applicant, and then we had the interviewers rotate from room to room. The applicants would go to their initial breakout room, stay there for their entire session, and then the interviewer would go into a room to talk to them, right? And so that seemed to make most sense, and it seemed to be the thing that was least error prone during our session. We did run into a little bit of a snag with this, in that if you look at how our interview schedule works, Chen usually interviewed 2 people in the same slot that we usually interviewed 1 person. So it made it a little bit tricky to try to kind of move people around in the middle of a session without kind of going to reset back to 0. So what we came up with to sort of fix that was sort of created a little break room where we could put an applicant that wasn't actually being interviewed at that time, who was sort of scheduled for a slot with Chen during those 10 minutes. So we had rooms for every applicant, and then a break room where we could put an applicant that was kind of waiting to see Chen at that time. There was a little bit of kind of a hybrid for those 2. What really kind of made this work really well was really practicing over and over and over again, making sure that we knew exactly what we were doing. And so the most important part is, even if we developed it, if we kind of came up with this format, it's always your program coordinator who runs the interview, right? When they're in person, they're the one with the schedule, they're the one that moves the students around, they're the one that keeps the timing. If your program coordinator doesn't know how to do Zoom correctly, you're going to run into a lot of trouble when they have a snag. And so the most important thing that we did was actually make sure that our program coordinator did this over and over and over again until they knew exactly what they were doing. Secondly, as I said, it was difficult to get sort of the applicants to move from room to room. It could also be difficult to get your interviewers to understand how to do it. And so what we did was, before the interview day started, we had about 30 to 45 minute session where we had the interviewers come in, log into Zoom, and we practiced moving from room to room several times and sort of figured out any snags that they were running into. And then finally is figure out what are the things that could go wrong, right? So could there be an applicant that ends up leaving the room inadvertently? Or is there an interviewer that disconnects from the session? And so practice these things happening before they actually happen and really kind of figure out what you're going to do for these situations and make sure that your program coordinator knows what they're doing for these situations. Some of the common pitfalls that we sort of were worried about running into is a drop connection, right? And so what happens if your interviewer's connection or interview's connection is not very good and their Zoom doesn't work very well? So what we had was a backup, right? So every interviewee had a phone number listed. The interviewers had a list of every interviewee's phone number, and if anything happened, they talked on the phone. Number two is, we know a lot of our interviewer faculties may be on the older side. Maybe they're not the most knowledgeable in terms of Zoom. You might train them for 30, 45 minutes, but they may still not understand how to move. So what we required for many of our interviewers was that they actually come in person, right? And so if you have the interviewers coming in person, logging to Zoom from their office, despite the fact that there's no interviewees there, it allows our program coordinator, whoever is around, to assist these people if they're having issues. And then I want to kind of finish this with a sort of 5 pro Zoom tips that maybe some of you guys know, but I think have really helped make things as smooth as they can. So number 1 is allowing people freedom of movement in small groups. So when you create breakout rooms in Zoom, you can go to options, and one of the options that you have is allow participants to choose group. So if you click that button, if there's any issues in the middle of a Zoom session, all you have to do is ask that person to kind of join back into the room they were. You don't have to manually kind of move people back and forth. So it allows you to kind of have people, if there's a mistake, sort of fix it on their own. So that I think was very cool. Number 2 is when you create the rooms, make sure that you rename them, right? Because if you just have room A, B, C, D, E, and E, it's gonna be really hard to remember who goes where. So name your rooms the name of the applicant. You know exactly who goes where, and that makes it a little bit easier. Number 3 is really learn to love the mute button. Maybe this is not as much for interview session, but as a host of a Zoom, you can always keep an eye on who is speaking or who's making the noise, and then just click the mute button and make them quiet. Because it's very hard when somebody's trying to present and they're asking, who's the one talking? Can somebody mute themselves? I feel like every Zoom session that I've been in runs into those problems. Since you as the host, you're monitoring who's the one that's talking, you can immediately mute them and make sure that things go smooth. And then finally is, and this is kind of a little bit of a hidden one, is if you've been on Zoom meetings where you constantly hear when people are leaving or entering the room, even as a participant, it can get really jarring and distracting to what you're doing. So from the participants part of your Zoom screen, you kind of open that 3 little dots in the bottom. There is an option that says play sound when somebody joins or leaves. It's usually checked, which means that if you start a default Zoom session, everybody's going to hear when people join or leave. And in a session where somebody's talking or giving a presentation, it can be really jarring. So I would suggest that you always turn that off in your. That's it for my part, and I think for all of us. So thanks to everyone for listening. And if anybody has any questions, comments, or ideas.
You know, I would add one thing about these Zoom sessions for the interview day. And one of the reasons why I think it was so successful for us was the program coordinator gave, and I think this is just very helpful, is the program coordinator gave each interview session a 2-minute warning, which basically lets you start wrapping up with the applicant, and the applicant knows that you are just going to leave the session as soon as, you know, you have 1 minute and then you're leaving. And it basically just preps them that it's, you know, it's not like you don't like them or you're not enjoying the session. It's just time is up. And our interviews have never been more on time because of that. So the fact that you as the interviewer just kind of stay on top of when to leave the room, it doesn't force the applicant to make the decision also to kind of leave the room when maybe they want to keep talking or something like that. So I think actually held the schedule very nicely.
Thanks, Chris. I don't know how I skipped this slide. It was number 3, and I don't know how I skipped it, but yeah, this is what we sort of had our program coordinator do. You just broadcast a message to all the rooms of however much time is left, and it allowed the interviewers to keep track of when they needed.
Thank you all very much. Really awesome. Does anybody have any ideas about kind of on these interview day kind of breakout rooms? Like, how do you keep it interesting? I feel like there's so much Zoom fatigue, and I'm actually even more nervous about it this coming season because we've all been doing it for so long. It was sort of novel last year during interview season almost, but it's not going to be novel anymore. So, and do we think that applicants might be tired of just like being forced into another room to have an awkward conversation, you know, staring at the camera on their computer and sort of trying to have their presence and facial expression kind of permanent smile in place, kind of losing all the, you know, faking the nonverbal communication? Any tips or ideas about that?
So Dan, are you talking about like a waiting room when you're waiting for the next interview? So I don't know if Felipe can maybe share our schedule. So I kind of thought about this as we were planning the interview day because, you know, I can't think of anything more awkward than having to sit in a waiting room for 30 minutes or more like we used to have when we did in-person interviews. So we structured our day so that the applicants were broken up into groups where they were only on Zoom for 3.5 hours total. That's inclusive of the kind of intro that I do, as well as the resident slideshow at the end. But they only have 10 minutes where they're sitting kind of in a waiting room. Otherwise, they're always interacting with somebody. So there's not really kind of this need to fill that space while they're waiting. So that was kind of one idea I had, just kind of minimizing that waiting time altogether.
Chen, do you want to put the schedule back up there and kind of go through?
I'm trying. Yeah, sorry, I did close the PowerPoint presentation, so I'm opening it up again.
Because I mean, it might be useful to share kind of how you approached the interview session, the information session at the beginning, and how we were able to pack in more applicants this year,
yep.
Or this past year because of kind of video recording and whatnot.
Right. So in the past, the way that our schedule worked, we would interview 13 candidates a day. We broke them into a morning session of 7 and an afternoon session of 6. And they did have quite a bit of kind of waiting around time where they were sitting in a room. But we would fill that time in person with residents who would drop in and, you know, see if they have any questions. There was also food and coffee. So it wasn't just kind of like awkwardly sitting in a virtual waiting room. Going into the virtual interview season, I had to think about the fact that, you know, I didn't want someone just stuck in a random room with a resident trying to make, you know, small talk for more than like a 10-minute period of time. So if you kind of look at the way that the schedule is made, from 8 to 9, we do a welcome and introduction. That includes a presentation by me about the program, as well as the chairman of the department drops in and has a short conversation. And then everyone gets kind of an intro to how the day is going to work. The applicants all get this schedule ahead of time, so they kind of know where they need to be and how things are going to move throughout the day. And they also kind of get access to, you know, who's going to be interviewing them that day in case they wanted to kind of look people up before their interview day. So if you look at applicant A, for example, from 9 to 9:20, applicant A interviews with Dr. Hahn, and then from 9:20 to 9:40, interviews with Dr. Leslie, from 9:40 to 10, interviews with Dr. Bravender, and then from 10 to 10:10, interviews with me, and then does have a 10-minute break where they're in a waiting room where they can just turn their camera off. They're not really expected to kind of make small talk with anybody. And then once those interviews are done, they all move into the resident presentation from 10:30 to 11, where the residents do a slideshow, and then to the group, they can answer any questions that the group can have. So really just kind of wanting to minimize the amount of awkward waiting around time that each applicant has, and also to really make it, you know, make the most use of the time that they have to be on Zoom. Because I felt like I would personally be annoyed if somebody had me waiting around on Zoom for an hour doing nothing, just so they could kind of structure their day for me to interview with all the people I needed to. And then that process was repeated again from 10:30 to 12:40. So our entire interview day ran from 8 o'clock to 1, but during that process, we were able to interview 16 people a day. So that's just one idea. I know a lot of people have different setups for this.
Yeah, one thing to point out about this model is that it does require 2 Zoom accounts. Not that that's a big deal, most likely for most people, but you have to have a second Zoom link for the afternoon because you're running the second session at the same time that the first session is finishing. One of the benefits of doing it this way for us is West Coast applicants, you don't want to ask them to interview at 5 a.m. California time. Much better to be able to offer them something that's a little bit more reasonable for their schedule.
Yes, although we ran into, it's interesting because we did it based on their medical school, although we had a couple of applicants who didn't tell us that they were going to be in California, even though they, went to SUNY downstate. And so did just call in at 5 a.m. So perhaps we will try to accommodate that a little bit better this year and just like have them let us know where they were going to be geographically for their interview day.
How long did it take you on Zoom to do a wrap-up meeting for 16 people? And then also only half of your, it looks like faculty only met half of the applicants. And so then you're sort of in this like faculty downtime for, I'm imagining, a couple hours after a pretty long day of interviewing.
Yeah, so for the faculty, it was a little bit more labor intensive than it was in the past. So it took a while, but we did have the faculty, we would do it in 2 groups. And so, Chris and I would be there for the entirety. And then we would have the faculty members who did the first, we would try to group that all together so that the faculty members could just do those students and then leave, and then have the other 2 faculty members who interviewed the other students kind of come on, or they could, if they were here, they could go get lunch and then come back for the second portion. But yes, it was a much longer day than 13 applicants. That being said, we could work with less number of days during the recruitment season and get just as many applicants in.
I see Tim Bellin wrote on the chat that they switched to interview pairs. Was the feedback what the applicants felt like it didn't seem onerous to be talking to 2 people at once?
Yeah, we were a little worried they'd feel like they were being bombarded by 2 faculty, but our sense, and of course this is the feedback they gave us, our sense was that everyone just found it an easier conversation than trying to talk one-on-one to a person on Zoom for 20 minutes. And it obviated some of the IT issues we had, like if someone's connection was bad, then hopefully the other person's connection was better. So, and our faculty found that rather than sitting one-on-one for however many hours we did, like 4 hours, they at least could like have some banter with one of our partners.
All right. So unless anybody else has any other final chats or comments, want to thank our team from Mount Sinai Morningside West. Really awesome. Just and also I want a course in slide design. Your slides are pretty awesome, and so that was really great. So thanks to everybody for coming out to this session. These are always on the 3rd Thursday. I'm saying that now, but I need to confirm. It's the 3rd Thursday of this month right now. Yeah, 3rd Thursday of the month, or 4th Thursday of the month at 3:30. The next one will be the end of August, and that will be on a holistic application review. These are all recorded and they're available through the Cord website, but certainly a great opportunity to have some interaction and sort of share some experiences and best practices. So thanks everybody for being here, and have a great rest of your summer, and we'll see you at the end of August.